Good afternoon. We're going to get started in just a minute or so, so hold tight and we'll see you in a bit. Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation How to Get Ready for a FSMA Produce Safety Rule Inspection webinar. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Today's webinar will provide an overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, Produce Safety Rule, as well as review how the FSMA Produce Safety Rule inspection process works in California. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture and produced in collaboration with the Western Regional Center to Enhance Food Safety. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Also note, this webinar is not providing legal advice. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan. I'll be your host today. I'm a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. We are pleased to have with us this afternoon Kaylee Feiereisel from Community Alliance with Family Farmers and the Farmers Guild, as well as Shelly Phillips from CDFA's Produce Safety Program. I'll introduce each speaker in more depth prior to their presentation. Before we get started with the main presentation, I wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar Attendee Interface, which is made up of two parts: the viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on the screen, and the control panel on the right. Within the control panel is how you can participate in today's event, so let's look at that. By clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close your control panel. From the View menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to keep it always open. The audio pane provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type your question and click send. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's event along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. Today, we also have a copy of the PDF of the PowerPoint slides available for download through GoToWebinar. Click on the blue file name of the handout in the Handouts pane. A PDF of the slides will open in your browser. You can view them in your browser or download them onto your computer. To expand and collapse the Handouts or Questions pane, click on the triangle next to the name of the pane. For example, if you can't see the box in the questions pane, click on the triangle and the box will expand. So we wanted to encourage you to write in and let us know where you're calling in from today and what crops you grow. And we'll kind of loop back around to that information later in the presentation. And note, we have a really good crowd today, which is great. And we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as we can, but we wanted to apologize in advance if we can't get to your specific question and encourage you to follow up after the webinar with those questions. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Kaylee Feiereisel serves as CAF and the Farmers Guild Senior Manager for Farm Services. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop their practices to meet new requirements. In addition to her background in organic farming, Kaylee studied food safety, local food systems, and food and agriculture policy while completing her graduate degree in public health nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. So Kaylee, thanks so much for being with us again this afternoon, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks so much, Megan, for teeing all that up for us and getting everyone oriented here. So like Megan said, my name is Kaylee, and I help provide technical assistance to farmers throughout the state through the Community Alliance with Family Farmers organization. So I'm going to start off this presentation and give a little bit of background about the Federal Food Safety Modernization Act, and then provide some examples of different resources that farmers can use to help get into compliance for FSMA. And then we're going to transition over to Shelly from CDFA, talking more specifically about CDFA's inspection information and things like that. So for my part of the presentation, I just wanted to have a little preface here and say, I know it's hard, but try not to get overwhelmed with all of the details in this presentation. And you have, as Megan mentioned, a PDF of these slides available, and we have a fair number of words on these slides, so you can, have some context there to refer back to later. We also will mention a number of different resources, so you can have those in your PDF here as a reference for later as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about kind of FSMA 101 information here to start, and then go through some specific FSMA related resources that are really useful. So to lay the groundwork here, because we've got a number of people on this webinar, which is fantastic, and we're not sure exactly where everyone's coming from as their starting point. When we talk about on-farm food safety and on-farm food contamination, there's three main types of ways that produce growing on our farms can get contaminated. The first way that it can get contaminated is physically, and that's a very visual usually occurrence where like a screw falls off of a piece of equipment and lands in a crate of lettuce, or there's like something that falls off of another part of equipment some way, and that is usually visible. And then another type of contamination is chemical, and that is where there might be fertilizer or sanitizer or herbicide residues that are, or maybe there's a spill of some kind, or maybe it's applied incorrectly. So those are ways food can get contaminated chemically. And then the third way that food can get contaminated, produce can get contaminated on farms, is biologically or microbially. And this is what you hear about, unfortunately, more than we'd like in the news about different food safety, foodborne illness outbreaks. And that could be from different viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi. But often we hear about it with bacteria and sometimes viruses. So there might be the mention of the different E. coli outbreaks, and specifically E. coli 0157H7 is the specific pathogenic form of E. coli for humans. And we've had previous outbreaks with salmonella in tomatoes and listeria in cantaloupe. And this is important to recognize because the biological and microbial contamination on produce is the main cause for foodborne illness outbreaks and for people getting sick from eating produce. So therefore, our regulation, and specifically the Food Safety Modernization Act, is really focused at trying to prevent and reduce biological contamination on farms and in our produce. So of the 3 types of ways produce or food can get contaminated, the regulations we're talking about, or the regulation, really it's just the FSMA, is really focused at biological contamination and how we can prevent that. Okay, so the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, I'm going to just say FSMA most of the rest of the time I talk, is not so much new anymore, but it's a federal regulation that was signed into law in 2011 by President Obama, and then it took a number of years for the Food and Drug Administration to write the 7 main rules covering different parts of the supply chain. So this is a huge overarching new regulation, and FSMA applies to many parts of the food supply system. It's not just on farms, it's also with facilities and packing houses and transportation companies and companies importing food. So this is very extensive. It even applies to animal food. But there's 2 parts of it, or 2 rules within the overarching FSMA regulation that may apply at the farm level. And the one that most certainly applies is the produce rule, or the produce safety rule. And then the other one, which may apply, is called the preventative controls rule. And the preventative controls is focused more towards facilities, and it may or may not apply towards a farm actually growing the produce. So today we're really focused on the produce safety rule, or the produce rule part of FSMA. So just one of those 7 big parts. Okay, with laying that groundwork, then in 2017 through 2019, there was a bunch of regulation implementation and education. And then starting this spring and onward, the enforcement of FSMA, and specifically the produce safety rule part of FSMA, has started to happen around the country, as well as additional education as we are all here right now talking and continuing to learn about this new process, the new regulation. Okay, well, I'm not sure if anyone on this webinar has actually seen the actual text of the FSMA regulation before, but if you're looking for some reading to help you, fall asleep at night, or, maybe it'll be very exciting, I'm not sure, you can check this link here at the bottom of this slide, and on page 74,547 and onward, you can find the actual text of the law. And I just have a little tiny excerpt of it here. 112.128 says, what requirements apply regarding pest control in buildings? And then the answer is, you must take those measures reasonably necessary to protect covered produce, food contact surfaces, and food packaging materials from contamination by pests in buildings, including routine monitoring for pests as necessary and appropriate. So that's a lot of words, and it might be kind of confusing, or it might not seem very clear, but that's actually for the benefit for farmers, because there's not a lot of the parts of the law that are prescriptive and tell us or tell farmers exactly what you need to do. And that's good because it's risk-based and has some ability there for farmers to adapt to their unique situation on their farm to meet the law in a way that still produces safe food and reduces risks. Okay, and then I'm going to now do a brief walkthrough, because within FSMA and the produce safety rule, farms get categorized into 3 main categories. And if folks on the webinar are not sure of those categories, it's important that we do a brief overview of them now to help lay the groundwork for the discussion later in this webinar. So some farms are fully exempt from the FSMA law for produce safety. And that would apply if a farm is growing produce that is only grown for personal or on-farm consumption, and or the farm is growing produce that is on the rarely consumed raw list by the FDA, or the produce goes through a kill step. And a kill step is something like growing fresh tomatoes that then go to a cannery and get pasteurized and put into cans, or growing grapes that get fermented into wine. Those are kill steps. Washing lettuce in a tank of water is not considered a kill step, or washing lettuce in a water with a sanitizer in it is not considered a kill step. So those are some criteria. Or if a farm has total annual gross produce sales of less than 25,000, that farm would be fully exempt from the produce safety rule of FSMA. And that produce sales is bolded in orange there because it's only talking about your produce sales, not if you also sell eggs on your farm or meat. That is not considered produce, so that income is not part of calculating that $25,000 exemption. So I know that's kind of a lot of detail, and if you're new to this, I recommend referencing this afterwards if you think that your farm may fall into this category. And what are those crops on the FDA's rarely consumed raw list? Well, there's some that we might expect, like eggplant and potatoes, and then there's some that are a little bit surprising, like figs and beet greens and beetroot. So here is the exhaustive list at this point in time that you can find at this link on the bottom of the slide. And if you are a farmer that's only growing figs and lentils, no matter how many acres or how many dollars you sell of those crops, your farm would be considered fully exempt from the law because you're growing crops on the rarely consumed as raw list. And the theory behind this list is that these crops get processed further in a further way that includes a kill step of some kind. So there's a lot that could be discussed about this list, but this is what it is at this point in time. And we can circle back to it in the questions at the end of the webinar if there are more in-depth questions. Okay, and just to keep us on our toes a little bit more, I know I said that the threshold for farms was $25,000, but that is not a static $25,000. That is a $25,000 that adjusts to 2011 dollars, because with inflation, money is worth less each year. And so the law was passed in 2011, so $25,000 was $25,000 in 2011, but now each year we have to adjust that financial threshold. So basically, thankfully, the FDA has created a table that you can find at the link on the bottom of this page, and this end row here in column that says average 3-year value for 2016 to 2018 is the key part of this slide. So if you're trying to figure out if your farm meets this exemption, you would need to see of your gross produce sales for the 2016, 2017, and 2018 year, when you add those 3 years together and average them together, are they less than $27,528? If so, then your farm is likely fully exempt, but you have to add the last 3 years together, average them, and then compare them to the adjusted value here. So that is just an important detail that folks should know about with these financial thresholds, that they are not just a static number. Okay, so moving along to the second farm category, we are going to talk briefly about the criteria that a farm would need to meet to be considered qualified exempt from the produce safety rule. So a farm must meet 2 conditions to be considered qualified exempt. The first is to have less than $500,000 in annual gross food sales, and that again is with that rolling average from the last 3 years that you convert to 2011 dollars. and the farm needs to sell the majority of the food directly to customers, which the law calls qualified end users. So examples of directly to customers could include a customer at a farmer's market or a restaurant, or to a retail food establishment, which could be an individual grocery store, but not a distribution center. And these sales must be within the same state or 275 miles from the farm, or within the same Indian reservation. So your farm, to meet the qualified exempt criteria, would have to meet both of these. You can't just look at the financial threshold of under $500,000 and say, okay, the farm's qualified exempt. You have to do that. The farm has to meet that and sell the majority of food. So more than 50.1% of your dollar sales need to be directly to people. So if you're selling a bunch of some crop to a big distributor that then sends it out to, a dozen grocery stores, or more than that, or across to different states to many different stores, then that is not sales that's considered to a qualified end user. So you wouldn't be able to count those dollars towards meeting the percentage of selling to a qualified end user. I know this is, if this is the first time hearing this, this is probably overwhelming, but I just want to say that there's other webinars on this that we'll reference later that we can circle back to. Okay, and then again, this $500,000 is adjusted into 2011 dollars, which makes a big difference here that right now this is actually up at $551. So that is important to note if your farm is hovering right around that $500,000 threshold. Okay, and then lastly, the main criteria for what farms fall into the category that they need to be in full compliance with the law or considered fully subject farms. These farms are basically everybody else that we didn't talk about already. So if the farm has a 3-year adjusted average gross sales greater than 500,000, no matter where you sell to, even if you just go to only farmers markets and you have $1 million in sales at all these farmers markets, doesn't matter that you sell directly to people. Your farm is considered too big, and you would need to be in full compliance with the produce safety rule. The second category is for farms that sell less than $500,000 in the adjusted food sales, but they do not sell more than 50.1% to a qualified end user. So this could be a farm that has $100,000 in total gross food sales. So they meet criteria 1, they're under the $500,000, but they sell 80% of those. So they say they grow tomatoes, fresh tomatoes for sale on the market as fresh tomatoes, and they sell $100,000 of those each year, but they sell $80,000 of those dollars to a distributor who ships them around the West Coast. So those would not be considered sales to a qualified end user, and that is more than 50% of their sales. So that farm would not meet the qualified exempt criteria and need to be in full compliance with the produce safety rule. Okay, and then we have a timeline with varying types of deadlines here. The first column, you can see that FSMA compliance for the largest farms, which are over $500,000 in sales, actually was January 26, 2018, was when the law officially took effect for these farms of that size. For farms that are in the 250 to 499,000, the law took effect in January of this year. And then the next category of farms, the law will officially take effect this coming January. Inspection timeline is slightly different than what is the actual FSMA compliance, and you can see that there, and we'll hear much more about that from Shelly, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And then we have this last column here with the FSMA water compliance. And so this is for farms that need to be in full compliance with the law. There are specific water requirements, and those have been extended, the deadlines of being in compliance with those have been extended here. And there's much more that can be said about the water requirements for farms that need to be in full compliance. And there's full day trainings that go over what a farm that needs to be in full compliance would need to do, and we'll have a reference of those. Okay, so that was a high-level overview of walking through the FSMA produce safety rule and the three criteria, the three categories farm fall under the rule. And so I wanted to take a brief pause here and see if, Megan, we had any brief clarifying questions before going through the resources.
Yeah, so I wanted to encourage you, if anyone has some clarifying questions about the content that we just covered, please write those in and we can kind of clear those up before we move on. And then just to loop back to our questions from the beginning of the webinar, we have folks online from a bunch of places around California, Royal Oak, San Juan Bautista, Petaluma, and Vista. And then we also have someone online from Arizona. And as to what people are growing, it's also a diversity of crops. We have mushrooms, avocados, fruit, cucumbers, blueberries, rice and almond growers, and then also someone who's doing wash and package fresh carrots. So we did have a question come in asking whether does olive oil fall under, or is olive oil exempt basically from FSMA?
Well, olive oil is a processed product, so the produce safety rule is focused on raw agricultural commodities. So the actual olive oil would be something that would fall under the preventative controls rule, and I am not an expert in the preventative controls rule, but I don't know if Shelly has any comments on that.
Hi, Kaylee. Yeah, so it is, olive oil would be exempt from the produce safety rule, but not necessarily from the preventive controls rule, as you mentioned. And I'm not an expert on preventive controls either. That lies with FDA's purview.
All right, thank you. So yeah, there may be a little further exploration into the preventative controls rule, which is one of the 7 different rules of FSMA, to find out that answer. And then, and they're also wondering if table grapes were also subject to the rule.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for a while, table grapes were considered subject to the rule, or it was kind of unclear, but then the FDA issued I don't know, what do you call it, like a paper or a posting in the last few months that provided some clarity for a few different crops, including almonds and hops, and I believe table grapes was with that as well. But again, I'm gonna defer to Shelly here.
Hi, Kaylee. No, that's not correct. So table grapes are, they do fall under the produce safety rule. Wine grapes do not, however. So FDA issued guidance for, as you mentioned, hops, wine grapes, almonds, and pulse crops that were not specifically listed in the produce generally not eaten raw, such as pea, that is often used for protein powder. Those have discretionary authority guidance, so those do not fall under the produce safety rule, but table grapes do fall under the rule. So they will be subject to inspection under the produce safety rule.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, clarifying there. So table grapes, yes to the produce safety rule. Wine grapes, we got clarity, no to the produce safety rule. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then there's some other questions here we have about specific commodities, and we're going to get back to those at the end of the webinar just to kind of be mindful of time, but we will address those. But someone did ask that the picture on the screen is showing a box on the ground, and would that be an issue in terms of food safety?
Good, astute eye there. And yes, that would be. We want to keep things off the ground as, whenever, all the time possible. So that I have been using this picture and no one has ever brought that up. So whoever is seeing that, you are on top of your food safety and observation and catching things that need to be changed. So good job.
All right, great. So good. That means people are paying attention to the webinar too, which is good. So we're going to move on to the next section of Haley's presentation. But again, if you have more questions, we will loop back around to those at a couple of different spots in the webinar.
Thanks, Megan. So I just have a few more resources I wanted to show folks about. First, if you go to caff.org, caff.org, our website, we have, if you hover over programs at the top and then hover over food safety, there's this fact sheets and food safety plans template webpage. And if you click that link, it leads you here. And you can't see the whole page on this slide, but I believe there's almost 40 free Word document, English and Spanish translated different templates that can help you draft your farm's food safety plan, help you draft standard operating procedures or SOPs, help you draft policies for different procedures on your farm or different topics on your farm, like what is your blood policy if there's blood involved in any kind of situation and things like that. So while the produce safety rule within FSMA does not explicitly require farms to make a farm food safety plan, similarly to organic certification and how you have to create an organic system plan for that, for food safety, it is also helpful to have a written guide and a written document that explains your farm's practices and policies and procedures for different topics on food safety on your farm. So I just wanted to share this if folks were not aware of it, that it's a great free resource that you can use as a start and a guide. And then, like I said, they're all Word documents, so you can and will need to, delete sections and add a bunch of information that's unique to your farm. And this is just a little start of the simplified food safety plan. So you can see it helps guide you through, and there's lots of places where you would add information. And then another resource I wanted to point out is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and their extension folks there that have created a qualified exemption. So if your farm fits into the qualified exemption category under the produce safety rule, there are important records that you need to keep to prove that. And this is a tool that they've created that has Excel that has the different templates and different parts of information that you would need to be tracking to help demonstrate that your farm is indeed qualified exempt. And you've got some links there to access it. And then some other resources that may be helpful for farms that are realizing right now, or that you need to be in full compliance with the law and you don't think you're fully prepared yet. We have a number of webinars that CCOF and CAF have done in the past where we've really broken down. Today, we just mentioned the criteria for the different farm categories, but we're not saying really much about what farms need to actually do in those categories. And so there's other webinars that talk about what do you actually need to do. And there's a bunch listed here. And then the last link there is for upcoming Produce Safety Alliance or PSA grower trainings. And that is a course that all farms that need to be in full compliance with the law have to have at least one supervisor or manager attend that course, and it's a day long, and there's a lot of content covered about what farms need to do to be in full compliance with the law. So any farmer can go to it to just learn, even if your farm is fully exempt or qualified exempt, and I'd encourage you to continue learning about all of this food safety regulation and best practices. But for farms that need to be in full compliance with the produce safety rule, you are required to have at least one person go. Okay, and then another somewhat new and exciting resource is our National Food Safety Clearinghouse that has been created and hosted by the University of Vermont extension there. And if you go to this link there that's on the page, you'll see this yellow bar and this text here. And then if you click this yellow search resources box, it expands out and gets a lot bigger, and you can see that there's a bunch of different categories of types of resources and topic areas, and then of course a keywords box where you can type in some stuff. And I recommend this resource because it's a more vetted version of a Google for searching for help and information on your on-farm food safety questions. So you can see I typed in post-harvest design, and then there's some green spinners for farm use and the ideal wash and pack facility layout. Those are just two of the resources that popped up. So it's a little bit more rigorous than just randomly Googling things. And then lastly, I just want to say a brief word about FSMA and the organic certification and how there is a lot of overlap between the two regulations, but there's also some differences. So if you're already organically certified, which you probably are being on this webinar, I want you to realize that FSMA does not require you to do anything that would be against the National Organic Program standards, and there's the specific language in FSMA 11284 that says that FSMA does not require covered farms to take measures to exclude animals from outdoor growing areas or to destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear farm borders around outdoor growing areas or drainages. However, organic certification does not prepare you for everything for FSMA. You're going to need to do more work with your worker health and hygiene program and water than beyond what just organic doesn't touch on those topic areas. So I want to make sure to leave enough time for Shelly to cover the good content that she has, and I'll just wrap it up here. And if Megan, there's any questions you think are good to go over now, we can do that, or we can wait till the end.
Great, yeah, we had some questions come in and we have a little time, so I think we'll get to some of them now. One of them is, if you're a qualified exempt, what degree of food safety protocol are you required to implement in your production? How do you prepare for that inspection differently than other classifications? So I think we're going to get to the second part of that question in the second half of the webinar, but do you want to talk a little bit about what food safety protocols a qualified exempt operation might need to put into place?
Sure, yeah, and I'll take that a kind of the most generic approach to that. There's obviously probably 10 questions that come to mind that I'd want to ask this farm to know about their situation, but if your farm is considered qualified exempt under the produce safety rule, you'd want to make sure you're keeping all the required records to prove that. And then more importantly, you'd want to make sure that you're implementing good agricultural practices or GAPs on your farm, which is a voluntary set of practices that help reduce food safety risks on your farm. And that is in various topic areas. That's with your water, and that's with your workers, and that's with your equipment, and with your soil amendments. And so it's basically you do a thorough risk assessment of where are the likely risks for from a food safety standpoint on your farm, and then what are the practices and policies you can put in place to help reduce those risks. And I would just say that, you know, food safety is the responsibility of every farmer and every farm. We're you know, no matter what FSMA says about you, you gotta have a serious attitude about keeping your food safe for, you know, your business staying in business, and just because it's the right thing to do. So I would just encourage any farmer, and specifically this one with this question, to feel free to follow up with me and we can talk in more detail about your farm's specific situation.
Great, thank you. And then we had another question come in that's asking, they're still a little confused and want to know whether a farm who sells less than 25,000 in produce, but more than 500,000 in other ag products like wine or cheese, what category do they fall into?
Yeah, I have an answer for that, but let's just start with Shelly's answer on that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, could you repeat the question for me, Megan?
Sure. So this operation is wondering if an operation or a farm that sells less than 25,000 in produce, but more than 500,000 in other ag products like wine or cheese, what compliance category do they fall into?
If they sell less than $25,000 worth of produce, they would be exempt from the produce safety rule.
Okay, so even if they sell like 700,000 in wine and then have like a little, you know, vegetable garden or vegetable plot on the side of their winery that's less than 25,000, they would be exempt because their produce is less than the 25,000.
Correct.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions on your end, Megan?
Yes, we have one more question about whether you can use chicken tractors in vegetable production, because you know it helps build soil fertility and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a good question. Specifically under the produce safety rule within FSMA, you can use raw manure applications to your growing area. Right now, the law, so FSMA and the produce safety rule is science-based, research-based regulation, and the data right now for the die-off rates of pathogens in different animal scats is not robust enough to determine a certain number of days after the last raw application of manure to a growing area before you should be harvesting from that area. So right now in this 5 to 10 years or so time frame, there's more research being done around the country on this topic area. But for right now, for FSMA under this topic of animals and manure and different soil amendments that are considered untreated or raw, those are basically, they're recommending that farmers follow the National Organic Program standard of waiting between 90 or 120 days after the last raw application of manure happens before the first harvest. So if you're going to have a chicken tractor go across a field and then you're going to plant tomatoes that are trellised up on T-posts and, you know, feet off the ground on that field, those are going to be the chickens are going to need to leave that field at the very latest 90 days before you intend to first start harvesting from that field. If you're going to do the chickens and then have a crop that is closer to or touching the ground, you would need to have them off of there at the very latest 120 days before you start to harvest. That's the current standing of that at this point in time related to FSMA and the produce safety rule. However, like I said, there's more research that's happening.
Great, thank you. So I think we're gonna wrap things up for now and move on to the next section of the webinar. But again, if you have more questions about Kaylee's presentation, still send those in and we'll get to them a little bit later. And Kaylee, thank you very much again for your presentation and that good kind of 500,000 level overview of the produce safety rule.
No problem.
So next, I would like to introduce Shelly Phillips, who's the program supervisor for CDFA's Produce Safety Program and the Division of Inspection Services. Shelly is responsible for overseeing the implementation of the produce safety rule in California. She has a team of 6 inspectors that conduct inspections throughout the state. Shelly completed a master's in conservation biology from the California State University, Sacramento, and has more than 19 years in the field of environmental compliance and project management. So Shelly, welcome. We're very happy to have you here today to fill us in on what to expect with the produce safety rule inspection, and I will hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us, everybody. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what FSMA is, and if I can get my mouse to work, there it goes. Talk about the produce safety rule a little bit, although Callie covered it in more detail than what I need to do for my section. And then talk to you about what the produce safety program has been doing, the farm questionnaire that we mailed out this year, and what to inspect for California inspections. And then to final would be to provide you resources that we have available for farmers. So as Kelly mentioned, the Food Safety Modernization Act is a set of 7 regulations for food safety. It's proactive approaches, prescriptive measures that need to be taken on the farm, in the processing plants, in transportation, and several other areas. The Produce Safety Rule, which is regulated by California Department of Food and Agriculture, we implement that at the state level through funding from FDA. It's in collaboration with the Food and Drug Administration and California Department of Public Health. It is only one rule under FSMA, and it also sets prescriptive measures for food safety on the farms. This is implemented in California by the Produce Safety Program. So why is this important to produce farmers? Well, we want to establish and promote food safety culture. And so first and foremost is educating farmers on how to go about doing that and producing safe food. We want to emphasize food safety first, and then it also gives you prescriptive measures to how to conduct your production activities on the farm. The Produce Safety Program, our core value is to educate before we regulate. So we developed the program over the last couple of years, and we've been doing a lot of educational seminars, workshops, and training, as well as putting out a lot of outreach and education materials for farmers. We are going to facilitate compliance through that education on the farm, and we regulate through the on-farm inspections. And I'll go into more detail on that in further slides. So how do you comply with the produce safety rule? So as Callie mentioned, you want to take a produce safety rule grower training course or alternate criteria that suffices to cover all the material that Produce Safety Alliance puts out in their training programs. You want to implement those required food safety practices on your farm and document those food safety practices so that when an inspector comes out, he or she can verify that you're following good food safety practices. We would love it if you returned the farm questionnaire that we sent out that helps us determine farm inspection priority and help us determine if the farms are exempt. And then lastly, have an inspection to determine compliance. Inspections are not by will call. We will call you, so you can't call and request one, and I'll go into that in further detail later on as well. So as I mentioned, we sent out, we mailed questionnaires and letters to farmers. We mailed over 20,000 letters this year to farmers. And the reason we did that is because we're lacking a lot of specificity on our farms in California. So we received information from the pesticide use reports, and that provided contact persons and farm address and a commodity group, but it didn't give us phone numbers a specific food safety person to contact or physical address of the farms. We also didn't get those specific commodities. So a commodity group we got would be like vine fruit, which could include grapes, table grapes, wine grapes, could include melons, it could include kiwi fruit. So we need to be able to say what specific commodities those farms are growing. And then also we need sales tiers. So where do you fall? Are you exempt in the, under 25,000, or are you a large farm that's growing and producing more than $500,000? And that's because the inspections are graduated in over several years. So we mailed out 2 sets of the questionnaires. We mailed out to everyone on our list that we thought fell in the large farm category. And we mailed about 12,000 farm letters and questionnaires in February in that set. And then we sent out approximately 15,000 letters in August. So those are trickling in. We did ask for those to be returned by August 31st, but there's no hard deadline. So if you haven't done so already, please send those questionnaires in to help us prioritize farm inspections. So as Kaylee mentioned, there are exemptions for the produce safety rule. If you're growing for personal consumption, you're growing produce that is on the list of rarely consumed raw, or if you're growing those almonds, hops, pulses, and wine grapes that we're exercising enforcement discretion on, and then produce that is goes through a processing. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. If there are further questions, we can discuss it in more detail, or feel free to email Kaylee or myself on questions specific to the exemptions. So if you are a farm with average annual produce sales less than $25,000, graduated on the scale here, then you are exempt from the produce safety rule. You may be required to show proof of that through your tax records or sales records. However, with the number of farms that we have to do in California for inspection, it's not likely we're going to get to those anytime soon. So next I'm going to talk about inspections and what they look like, who is going to be inspected and when, how we determine whether or not your farm is going to get inspected, and again, when that would occur, costs involved in that, which there are none. I just want to say that right off the bat. And then how long does an inspection take, and how can you prepare for those? So farm size categories, we started inspections in April of this year for large farms that are over $500,000. And we are basing our prioritization on, if you fall into the large category and you are harvesting crop, we want to give you a call and set up an inspection. So if you fall into that category, you may receive a call from an inspector this year. We work with you on when you're harvesting and when's a good time to come out. And then next is small farms. So if you're between $250,000 and $500,000, inspections start next spring. And I believe this is where we're going to stop for a poll. Is that correct?
Yes.
Megan?
So yeah, we're going to do, just to kind of get a sense of where folks fall in these categories, and when you may be expecting a inspection or not. So I'm going to launch a poll. It'll come up on your screen. And so if you want to let us kind of fill that in, we'll give people a couple minutes to click and let us know which category your farm falls into. And we'll just give some folks some time to do that. Okay, so it looks like people have had a chance to take the poll, so we'll close that and then share the results. So Shelly, do you want to talk a little bit about who we have in the audience?
Yeah, certainly. So it looks like we have a fair number of large farms. So if you have not received a call from us, it's possible that you may receive one by the end of the year. However, as I mentioned, we are following the commodities as they're being harvested throughout California. So if you usually harvest in February or March, then you're not going to receive a call from us this year. Small farms, it looks like we don't have anyone in that category on the webinar, so I'll skip that. Very small farms come up for inspection in 2021, so it'll be a while before we give you a call for the inspections.
All right, great. And then it looks like the rest of the people online are either exempt or not applicable, so they're here attending in some other capacity instead of working on a farm. So thank you for sharing that with us, and we can move back to the presentation.
Thank you, Megan. Okay. So we mentioned already that large farms received inspection, or we're conducting inspections on large farms this year, small farms next year, and then very small farms 2021. So what does an inspection look like? How long is this going to take? What's this going to cost me? So first off, there is no cost for it. It is a regulatory inspection, so our inspectors are commissioned and credentialed through FDA, and we work on behalf of FDA. So they arrive on your farm, and hopefully you are prepared for an inspection, and I'll go over that in the next slide. But how long it takes all depends on what activities you've got going on and the size of your farm, what observations or issues that we're seeing during an inspection, and then how well prepared you are. In order to prepare for the inspection, know what activities are happening on your farm and when your staff takes breaks and when they're harvesting and which ranch location and how long that's going to take to travel to a specific ranch. We are going to look at documents and training records, maps of fields, visitor policies, any cleaning and composting records. So if you have those available and have them ready for us, that's a good thing to have available when the inspector arrives on your farm. And also knowing your harvest schedule is important. And then you can also have an on-farm readiness review with the caveat that we're not conducting on-farm readiness reviews for farms that are already under inspections, meaning the large farms, and then in the springtime, small farms would no longer be ready or available for an on-farm readiness review. And what an on-farm readiness review is a free, voluntary, personalized discussion that's going to look at your growing conditions, your harvesting practices, any packing house operations and water sources. It's going to be strictly educational, so the inspector may take notes, but they're going to leave you with the notes on what you can do in order to prepare for an inspection, and it will clarify specifically how the produce safety rule applies to your farm activities, and it's open to discussion and questions at this time. So we are still doing on-farm readiness reviews. If you would like to have one for your farm, please give our office a call and set those up. We do ask that you attend a grower training course prior to having an on-farm readiness review, and because that prepares you for what to expect and know a little bit more about the produce safety rule in that manner. Also, if you have implemented a food safety plan for your farm, that will help you with the on-farm readiness review, and have your food safety consultant or your whoever is responsible for your food safety, have them attend the on-farm readiness review with you. They are intended for educational purposes. We are a regulatory body, and so if we found an egregious condition on the farm, we would have to contact FDA and CDPH. And egregious conditions mean that there is produce that has been contaminated and could make someone sick. So back to produce safety rule inspections. So there's basically 4 parts on the farm and then 1 office review afterwards. So we're gonna, let me back up just a minute. So we're gonna go through an introduction on the farm and then conduct the walkthrough, talk about corrective actions, summarize in an exit interview with any of those observations or actions that need to be corrected, and then it goes to our office for a compliance officer's review. We're going to go over every topic of the produce safety rule. So we're going to look at what your training has been and how you're conducting health and hygiene on the farm, whether or not you've got biological soil amendments, and how what your procedures are with what your procedures are for animal intrusion. So how do you prevent contaminated produce from entering the market? So during the introduction, an inspector is going to, well, if I can back up just for a second, the inspector will call you and set up a time to come out, and that'll be prearranged. We don't generally do unannounced inspections. So at the designated time, we're going to meet with the produce safety employee or manager on the farm. We're going to show you our FDA credentials, and we're going to provide you with a notice of inspection form. We're also going to discuss the scope of the inspection and your organization and what the day's activities look like for the farm. During the walkthrough, we're going to observe all your farm operations. So what are you harvesting or packing at that time? What water sources are you use? We're going to want to look at your well or any other water source that you're using. We're going to ask questions about the practices that we are observing on the farm. We're going to want to observe your workers taking a break to see what they've been trained to do once they return to harvesting material. We're going to ask about other activities that may take place on the farm or talk about activities that are taking place nearby. So does somebody have a wild animal park next door, or they have a compost field next door to your operations? We're going to talk about those. We take notes and review your records, and we review your maps of your farm location if you have those available. And we explain while we're observing what is being looked at and why those are important, and then discussing those regulatory concerns that we have and any public health implications. We discuss those at the time of observation, and then we'll also do a recap at the end. So for exit interview, we're going to go over any regulatory concerns or findings, any observations that we had, just to recap and let you know what needs to be completed in order to come into compliance. We're going to provide information on resources or technical assistance at that time. And then we're going to document any corrections that you made at the time that the inspector was on the farm. We identify a time frame that works for you and the inspector as well if you have corrective actions that can't be completed at that time. We're there also to answer questions and to continue that educational forum with the farmer. And then we also leave you with FDA's Form 4056, which is an inspection observation form. So while our inspector is out there, they're making copious notes about their observations and any corrective actions, and that gets transcribed onto an inspection report summary, which then goes to our compliance officer. They review all the documents that are submitted by the inspector, and they're going to make recommendations for compliance actions. And if a timeline hasn't been agreed on, they will establish that. They're going to, again, provide technical assistance and education and answer any questions that you have. And then they provide that final report, the inspection report summary, to the farmer. What if you're out of compliance? The farmer is showing us that they've got training records, but they haven't been signed. So an easy fix for that is that they sign the records. Or we observe that your workers are having lunch and using the restroom, and then they go back into the field without washing their hands. Corrective action for that would be to stop them from harvesting, return them to wash their hands, and have a tailgate training right then on that, and then continue their work. The inspectors are authorized to take a variety of actions, but again, we begin with on-site education unless it's an egregious condition. Most of the time, it's just a corrective action. What we have seen, we've conducted about 70 inspections so far in California this year since April, and most of what we're seeing are fairly easy corrective actions and minor issues on the farms. Minor violations are handled through that on-site education and working with the farmer to have a corrective action put in place. Egregious violations, those that are significant, or you have food contaminated and that's going to pose an imminent threat to public health. As I mentioned before, we are under our obligation to inform FDA and CDPH, and then that may accelerate an on-farm follow-up inspection or investigation with FDA and CDPH, and could mean recall of product. So I just want to touch briefly on when an unannounced inspection can occur. So we sent out several thousand farm letters and questionnaires, and we have gotten some response either verbally on the phone or through the mail that says, oh, take me off your list. I don't want to be involved in your program. And I just want to point out that the FSMA Produce Safety Rule is not an optional program. It is a federal regulation that's being implemented in California and other states as well throughout the country. And so if we get a letter back or we get a phone call back asking to opt out, we're going to confirm whether or not you are exempt from the produce safety rule, but then we're going to do a follow-up letter that says, hey, this is not an optional program. We need you to respond to this questionnaire. Otherwise, we may come out and do an unannounced inspection. If there's a lot of pushback from the farm and I don't have time for you and you've pushed us off 3 times, we may do an unannounced inspection at that point. But we're here to really work with you on what time works for you and when you're harvesting, and really help educate the farmers on the produce safety rule. So we don't want to take that hard stance of, hey, it's not optional, you need to do this. So we're asking that you please send in those questionnaires or contact our office in some manner to let us know that you believe you're exempt or you're not, and help update our records. So other conditions that may force an unannounced inspection is if you have previous produce safety issues that have not been corrected and we need to do a follow-up inspection or investigation in response to a complaint or foodborne illness outbreak. So lastly, I want to leave you with some resources that we have available. CDFA's website for produce safety is up and running, and we have a lot of good information on that website. We also have a newsletter that you can sign up for that we push information out on a regular basis for. There's also the Produce Safety Alliance, and not just their upcoming grower training classes, but they have a wealth of information, including records, templates, and food safety plan templates on their website that can be a good resource for that. And then also FDA's website, as Kaylee mentioned, if you want to read the Food Safety Modernization Act, this is where you can find the full language to that. So again, I thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, we're here to answer those.
Great, thank you very much. That was a great overview. And we've had a number of questions come in, so we're going to kind of get to some of those. But I also wanted to state, just because we have some attendees that are from other states, and this may be obvious, but just to reiterate that what Shelly just presented is how California is doing their inspections, and all the states are doing their inspections through their state or through the FDA, so they vary by state to state. And so just kind of keep that in mind if you're not currently residing in California. It'd be good to check in with your state Department of Agriculture on how they're running the produce safety rule inspections in your state. So just kind of a quick clarifying question, but someone was wondering whether the results of the inspection are either posted online or otherwise made available to the public.
No, they are not posted online, and they would only, I don't believe that they would be made available through the public. However, through the Public Records Act request, we could have requests for specific farm inspections, but we keep them confidential as far as we can. However, they are federal and state documents, so they are subject to PRA.
Great, thank you. And then someone else was wondering if there's an inspection checklist that they can look at.
We have on our website a resource that's called What to Expect During an Inspection, and that's as far as the checklist that we have provided at this point. If you want a specific checklist, just know that we don't have one available, but the Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations Part 1112 for standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption is what we follow. And so we're going to cover every part that is in that Code of Federal Regulations.
Okay, thank you. And then someone else was also wondering, during the site inspection, should it be expected that the inspector will interview workers?
We generally don't, unless that we observe something specific that we need to address, but we are more likely to address it to the foreman or the produce safety manager that is attending the inspection.
Thanks. And someone else wrote in, if you hire a third party for harvesting, shouldn't they be responsible for their records, or what is the farm's responsibility kind of in the food safety FSMA realm if you hire a third party harvester?
So ultimately it's the farm's responsibility to have those records available for an inspector to review. And that can be within 24 hours, but ultimately it's the farmer's responsibility, even if he's hiring third-party contractors. And the same goes for food safety training for those workers, health and hygiene training for those workers. It's ultimately the farmer's responsibility to ensure that that is completed.
Okay, thanks. And did you have any examples from farms that you visited at how people are working with the third-party harvesters to kind of work that out? Kaylee, feel free to jump in as well.
So what we're seeing when there are third-party contractors is that they have trained their workers and they can provide those records within 24 hours to the inspector.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then someone is wondering, can large farms still participate in the OFRRs?
No, they cannot.
Okay, so the deadline has passed on that for large farms.
Correct.
And then, so we've had a couple people write in that have third-party certification through either Global Gap or Primus, and they're wondering whether those certifications and risk assessments align with FSMA.
So there are a lot of similarities between those third-party audits and the produce safety rule regulations. However, we do take that into consideration when we're doing an inspection, but it does not mean that you're compliant with the produce safety rule just because you've done a third-party audit.
Okay, thank you. And so let me see. We had a bunch of things come in. Can one individual for a farm management company be the produce safety rule trained individual for multiple farms?
Yes, however, they are responsible for the day-to-day operations and be able to manage and oversee the workers to make sure that that has been completed. So we generally, if they can be on a farm during harvest activities or packing activities, and then move to another farm when they're conducting their harvest, but they have to be available to oversee the day-to-day operations of the farms during harvest and packing.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. So we also had some people that are wondering where they can find out the schedule for the produce safety rule grower trainings in California. And I think you had on your links the Produce Safety Alliance website that lists trainings all over the place. Do you have any other resources that would be good for that?
No, so the Produce Safety Alliance is really the clearinghouse for all trainings in California that are conducted through their program. And so we do have classes on CDFA's website under our training resources. However, they're also linked on the Produce Safety Alliance training. So that is really the best location to get grower training courses.
And I would add to that, I just went onto the upcoming grower trainings webpage of the Produce Safety Alliance, and they have a search box in the top because there's a lot of trainings listed. And when I type California in, it looks like the only training scheduled, upcoming training scheduled is January 21st, 2020 in Bakersfield. And I know that's a long ways away, but I would tell folks on this call right now to keep checking back on here, because I imagine, I know CAF ourselves, my organization, and I'm sure a number of other folks are going to provide many more trainings this winter and into early next spring, and they're just not posted yet. So I imagine a bunch more in California will pop up here from October, late October, November, December onward.
Yeah, thank you, Kaylee. And I think that's the same thing with the training list on the CDFA's website, is that we have a full list of all the classes that we intend to provide under our subsidized courses, but they don't have the location, specific office location confirmed yet. So those aren't on the PSA training website. So you can see that we've got courses listed coming up, but we don't have the location for them yet. So they'll be continually updating the Produce Safety Alliance website with those trainings as we have more information.
Great, thank you. So someone also was wondering, do you know where we can find food defense training for farm employees?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. Do you know where we can find food defense training for farm employees?
Food defense training?
Yeah, maybe the person who asked that could write in and kind of explain a little more what they mean by that, and we'll loop back around to that. And then someone else was also wondering, will you offer any FSDP trainings?
We do not, but I think you can find some of those. You'd have to do a Google search for that. I'm not sure that that would come up on the Produce Safety Alliance, but that's not under the Produce Safety Program purview, so we would not offer those.
Okay. Thank you. Kind of looping back around, earlier in the presentation, we had some people had questions about specific commodities that whether they were fall under the produce safety rule or not. And one of them was dates, which I think we saw on the example was on the list of produce not covered by the rule. So I just wanted to confirm that dates are not subject to the produce safety rule.
Correct. So the produce that is rarely consumed raw list is a specific list. Those commodities are, that's an exhaustive list. So if it's on there, then it's not, does not fall under the produce safety rule. If it's not on the produce rarely consumed raw list and it's not on the list of fruits and vegetables such as list, then it is subject to the produce safety rule.
Thanks. And then also we have someone who grows prunes, and they are produces prunes, and they don't sell any of the fruit fresh. It's all processed and goes through a kill step to kill pathogens. And they're wondering if they would need to comply with the produce safety rule or not.
So it's my understanding that drying has not been validated as a sufficient kill step at this point. So they would fall under the jurisdiction of the produce safety rule. Okay,
and the same would be said for raisins as well, as they're dried. Okay, so prunes and raisins, it looks like they are subject to the produce safety rule, and then the final one was pistachios.
They are subject to the produce safety rule.
Okay. Great. So I think, see if we have any other questions coming in, but it looks like we've answered most of them. We do have a few more minutes, so Shelly and Kaylee, do you have any final remarks you'd like to say before we take one final question?
This is Kaylee. I would just say thanks to everyone for being on this webinar, and we put a ton of different resources in here, so I just encourage folks to take a look at some of those, and I'm more than happy if anyone wants to reach out to me with any follow-up questions.
Yes, and I second that comment. Thank you, Kaylee.
Great, so thank you very much. I know you both have a lot going on and you're very busy, so we appreciate you taking some time out of your afternoon to give us a great overview of both the produce safety rule and the inspection process here in California. So thanks again.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So we're just gonna have a few other resources. As Kaylee mentioned, both Kaylee and Shelly had a lot of great resources in their presentations, and we have a few more added here at the end. A couple months ago, we did a webinar that was really good if you fall into the exempt or qualified exempt category that goes a little more into depth about some record keeping that you need to keep to prove your exemption. So it's a great webinar for smaller producers. And then, as Kaylee mentioned, we have a whole webinar series for farms that must fully comply with FSMA, including one that goes into more detail on the ag water requirements, and as well as some of the ways that organic and FSMA record keeping, you can kind of dovetail the two so that you're keeping one set of records for two regulations when you can. And here are just some more general good food safety resources, and we'll be sending out the PDF of the PowerPoint slides so you can explore those more on your own. And just to note, we have a bunch of webinars coming up this fall, so check out the CCOF events and training website. We'll have another food safety webinar in November that goes into demystifying some of the common questions about food safety and FSMA. So join us for that. And also, if you have a high school student in your life, the CCOF Foundation Future Organic Farmer Grant Fund is accepting grant applications for organic focused FFA supervised agricultural experience projects. And we'll be accepting those through November 15th. So we'd love to see what projects the young people in your life have come up with. So thank you again for attending the webinar. It was great having you here with us this afternoon, and please fill out the evaluation form that'll pop up on your screen after we close out of the webinar. And that just helps us improve our offerings as well as get ideas for future trainings. So thanks and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Megan.